Every empire thinks its currency will last forever. Britain thought so too. For more than a century, the pound sterling ruled the world, from London's banks to India's ports, from African mines to Middle Eastern oil. It wasn't just money, it was confidence printed on paper. But after World War II, that confidence cracked. The war had been won, but the empire was bankrupt. The pound, once the backbone of global trade, was suddenly just ink and hope. And the world quietly moved on. The dollar replaced it, not because America conquered Britain, but because the world believed in a new story. Now, decades later, the same story is repeating, only the names have changed. The United States stands where Britain once stood, debt-ridden, overextended, yet convinced that its currency is untouchable. And outside its borders, new powers are building another system. One trade deal, one digital ledger, one gold bar at a time. History isn't echoing by accident. It's following a pattern. And if you trace that pattern carefully, you'll see that de-dollarization isn't rebellion, it's succession. Britain emerged from the Second World War standing tall but hollow on the inside. It had survived the bombs, won the battles, and carried the pride of victory. But beneath the surface, the empire's financial lungs were collapsing. The war had drained almost every reserve of gold, foreign currency, and industrial strength the nation once commanded. By 1945, Britain owed the United States more than it had ever owed anyone in history. Its ships were sunk, its factories exhausted, and its colonies restless. Yet, in London, politicians still spoke the language of power, as if the empire's balance sheets were just a temporary inconvenience. They weren't. They were a countdown. The British government printed optimism. The newspapers called it a reconstruction. But rebuilding an empire with borrowed dollars was like patching a sinking ship with gold leaf. It shimmered, but it didn't float. America had become the lender of last resort, and that meant the U.S. could now dictate the terms of survival. In 1946, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed. $375 billion, or as a lifeline wrapped in conditions. Britain accepted because it had no choice. The U.S. demanded that the pound sterling become freely convertible to dollars once again, forcing Britain to expose its currency to the brutal truth of the global market. For a brief moment, it worked. There was celebration. London imagined itself rejoining the financial elite. But as soon as convertibility began in 1947, the illusion shattered. Nations holding pounds rushed to exchange them for dollars. Confidence fled faster than policy could chase it. Within weeks, Britain's reserves were gone, the experiment was dead, and the pound was suspended from convertibility. What had been dressed as cooperation was, in reality, capitulation. This was the moment when Britain learned that empires do not fall from military defeat. They fall when the world stops trusting their promises. The pound wasn't just a currency, it was the psychological anchor of an empire. When that anchor lifted, the entire global hierarchy began to drift. It wasn't an economic crisis. It was an identity crisis. Britain was no longer the world's banker. It was now a debtor in a system it once ruled. And while London tried to hide the damage behind ceremonies and speeches, Washington began quietly building its own empire. One not of colonies, but of contracts. Every loan, every reconstruction plan, every barrel of oil priced in dollars pulled the world closer to America's orbit. The Marshall Plan poured billions into Europe, rebuilding allies and creating dollar dependence in one move. The U.S. didn't need to conquer territory, it conquered through belief. Each dollar became a vote of confidence in the American century. Britain watched it unfold, perhaps without realizing that it had just passed the crown. The handover wasn't formal. There was no treaty or coronation. It happened in meetings, in financial ledgers, in the quiet corridors of Bretton Woods where new rules were written while old powers were still mourning. The United States now held three things that Britain had lost: industrial dominance, creditor status, and global trust. From the outside, it seemed polite, two allies reshaping the post-war world together. But in truth, it was a replacement. The empire that had once measured the world in miles now watched another measure it in dollars. De-dollarization today may sound like a modern term, a product of digital finance and multipolar politics, but it's built on the same human equation that destroyed Britain's supremacy. When your money stops representing strength, when others hold it but no longer trust it, you can legislate belief back into existence. It slips away, slowly, invisibly. The British pound didn't die in a single crash. It died in 1,000 quiet decisions. Each central banker, each trader, each government that moved from sterling to dollars played their part in the funeral. Procession. Confidence shifted one transaction at a time, and by the time Britain realized it, the world's financial language had changed. The uncomfortable truth for America is that the same signs are visible now. Record debt, dependence on foreign financing, a shrinking share of global manufacturing, and growing resentment toward financial dominance. The system still functions, but it does so on faith, and faith once tested rarely returns to its original strength. What Britain learned after 1945, America is now beginning to feel. Not panic, just fatigue. The kind that whispers, not shouts. When nations start finding new ways to trade, when gold reserves rise quietly, when allies start asking too many questions, that's not rebellion, that's preparation. Because the fall of a currency empire never begins with collapse. It begins with options. And across the world today, options are multiplying. Stay with this idea because the next step of this pattern explains how the dollar didn't just rise. It was engineered to inherit the world Britain could no longer afford to keep. The United States didn't seize global power. It inherited it. But inheritances come with unspoken conditions. After World War II, while Britain tried to rebuild from ruins, America built something bigger than territory. It built a financial order. Bretton Woods in 1944 wasn't a day, just a conference. It was the quiet signing of a new world contract. Representatives from 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire to design a system that could never again allow the chaos of the 1930s or the devastation of the war. On paper, the goal was stability. In practice, it was control. The dollar would be the world's anchor, convertible into gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. All other currencies would link to it. That meant the dollar was no longer just America's money. It was everyone's money. Every trade, every reconstruction plan, every post-war loan flowed through it. Britain, exhausted and indebted, accepted the arrangement because it had no other choice. The pound was history's prestige, but the dollar was the future's machine. American factories were running at full capacity while Europe's were in ashes. The United States held 3/4 of the world's gold. It was the only nation that could produce, lend, and rebuild simultaneously. Confidence naturally flowed toward strength, and by 1950, the world was financed in dollars. But America understood something deeper than Britain ever did. Power doesn't only come from military victories. It comes from being the middleman in everyone else. It's transaction. So Washington institutionalized its advantage. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, funneled more than $13 billion into Europe's reconstruction. Officially, it was aid. Economically, it was an investment in dependence. Nations receiving U.S. money had to buy American goods, hold dollars, and settle trade in the new system. The effect was magnetic. The more they rebuilt, the more they needed the dollar to do it. At home, Americans saw prosperity as the reward for sacrifice. Abroad, allies saw the dollar as security. But beneath both sentiments, a new empire was taking shape. One invisible, without colonies or gunboats, held together by belief and credit. Every international loan became a chain link. Every barrel of oil priced in dollars became another layer of reinforcement. The U.S. didn't need to occupy cities. It occupied ledgers. Britain, meanwhile, watched the transformation with a strange mix of pride and envy. It had taught America the language of empire, and now it was being spoken back with perfect fluency. London's financial elite still played an advisory role, but the decisions were now made in Washington and New York. The City of London remained symbolic, but the world's liquidity flowed through the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury. By the 1950s and 60s, the arrangement seemed unbreakable. The dollar was as good as gold, and gold was still trusted as the ultimate anchor. It was the era of American certainty, the age of suburbia, highways, and moonshot dreams. The empire of belief was complete, but embedded inside that perfection was the same flaw that had doomed Britain decades earlier, the assumption that dominance lasts forever. Every global currency begins as a promise and ends as an obligation. As the world grew, America had to print more dollars to finance trade and defense and development, but its gold reserves stayed finite. Foreign nations, especially France under Charles de Gaulle, began to notice the math didn't add up. By the late 1960s, dollars in circulation vastly exceeded the gold that supposedly backed them. The system's confidence crackled. The promise of convertibility, just like Britain's 2 decades earlier, was about to break. In 1971, President Nixon made the announcement that quietly changed history. The United States would suspend the dollar's convertibility to gold. It was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. The dollar had escaped its gold anchor and somehow survived. The reason was psychological, not structural. The world trusted the United States not because of what it owned, but because of what it represented: stability, military might, and technological leadership. The dollar had become a currency of belief, but every belief system carries the seeds of its own disbelief. The more the world relied on the dollar, the more vulnerable it became to American policy. Sanctions, interest rate changes, wars, all rippled globally. The same interconnection that gave the U.S. influence also gave it exposure. And while Britain's empire had once overextended through colonies, America's empire began to overextend through debt. Still, through the 1980s and 90s, the illusion held strong. The Cold War reinforced faith in the American system. The Soviet Union collapsed, the dollar reigned supreme, and history seemed to confirm the end of alternatives. But just as the pound had once seemed untouchable, the cracks were already there. Subtle, technical, slow. Trade deficits, outsourcing, a hollowing middle class, and a global economy built on debt rather than production. The world didn't notice at first. Empires rarely feel decline when it begins. They feel momentum. And momentum feels like immortality, right until it stops. That moment for the dollar isn't here yet, but it's visible in the distance. Because as we'll see next, the symptoms that once preceded the fall of the pound are reappearing. Only this time in a digital interconnected world where the challengers are many and the exits are ready. By the time the Cold War ended, the dollar had become something larger than a currency. It was the bloodstream of globalization itself. Every trade deal, every energy contract, every reserve account somewhere connected back to it. For decades, that worked, until the weight of that dependence started turning into pressure. Like Britain, in its twilight years, America's greatest strength slowly became its vulnerability. Because when the world runs on your currency, you can't stop printing it. And when you can't stop printing it, confidence starts whispering questions. The first cracks were small, almost invisible. The 1970s oil shocks showed that America's economy was no longer immune to external tremors. The Vietnam War, massive spending, and rising inflation made foreign holders of dollars uneasy. But the real warning came in the 1980s and 90s, when the U.S. began to transform from the world's workshop into the world's consumer. Factories closed, imports soared, and the service economy replaced manufacturing. The dollar was still strong, but it was being held up by reputation rather than output. Britain had lived that same phase after World War I, living off memory while production moved elsewhere. For a while, it didn't matter. The U.S. still had unmatched innovation, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and military reach. The internet boom of the 1990s gave a new face to prosperity, and the financial world declared that we'd transcended cycles. But behind the optimism, debt began to take the place of productivity. Corporations borrowed, governments borrowed, consumers borrowed, and the dollar's dominance made it easy. Everyone wanted dollars, so America could print them almost without consequence. It was the privilege of empire, the ability to live on credit while others saved in your currency. Yet history doesn't let any nation hold that privilege forever. When Britain lost its manufacturing edge and overextended its credit, it compensated with confidence. When that confidence broke, so did the pound. The U.S. is walking that same path. Massive deficits, costly wars, and a financial system dependent on foreign creditors, especially China and Japan, have built an economy that looks powerful on the surface but fragile underneath. The dollar still reigns, but it's now more like a dam holding back a rising tide of alternatives. In the early 2000s, as globalization deepened, countries began to quietly prepare for the day when the dollar might no longer feel safe. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated that thought. In one decade, America had gone from preaching free market discipline to bailing out its entire financial system with trillions of newly created dollars. Confidence survived, but it didn't fully recover. The rest of the world watched, realizing that the stability of the global system depended on America's internal politics, a dangerous realization. And then came the sanctions era, when the U.S. weaponized its financial dominance, cutting off nations from SWIFT, freezing assets, blocking access to dollar transactions. It revealed something Britain never could have done, that its power could be used as punishment. That message landed hard in capitals across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The dollar was no longer just a medium of exchange. It was a geopolitical tool. And tools can be avoided. The world's response wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and strategic. China expanded its trade in yuan. Russia and India began experimenting with direct settlement. The BRICS nations started building frameworks that could bypass Western systems altogether. Central banks increased their gold reserves. Oil producers tested pricing in local currencies. Each move looked small, but together they formed a pattern. The same pattern Britain once faced when the world started seeking options beyond the pound. In the financial world, timing is everything. You don't wait for collapse, you prepare for transition. The current global system isn't crumbling, it's diversifying. And diversification is the polite word for retreat. If history is a mirror, then this is the reflection. In the 1950s, the dollar inherited the world because it offered trust where the pound had lost it. Today, the dollar risks losing that same trust for the same reason: overreach, arrogance, and debt. But this isn't just an economic rhythm, it's emotional. Every empire has its story of exceptionalism, and every one of them ends with disbelief that decline could ever apply to them. Britain had its never again moment. America is writing its own. The difference now is that the challengers aren't waiting for permission. They're building quietly, just as America once did while Britain looked the other way. De-Dollarization isn't the collapse of the U.S. system. It's the rebalancing of global confidence. And confidence, once gone, doesn't return. It migrates. As we move forward, you'll see how that migration is happening in real time, through trade blocks, digital currencies, and gold. The same tools America once used to rise are being repurposed by the next generation of powers. The question isn't whether history is repeating itself. it's whether anyone is paying attention. Every empire assumes its rules will outlive its reach. The US believed that the dollar, once globalized, could never be replaced because no one could build a system large enough to rival it. But the world has changed. It's no longer about one empire versus another. It's about networks, technology, and quiet cooperation among countries that no longer want to live under a single financial authority. The term de-dollarization sounds like rebellion, but it's really adaptation. Nations are learning to breathe without depending on a single currency to oxygenate their economies. Look closely, and the new challengers aren't just opposing the dollar. They're recopying the same blueprint that once made it powerful. The dollar rose because the US offered stability, access to markets, and a belief that it would treat partners fairly. The new players are offering the same things, minus the moral lectures and sanctions. China's Belt and Road Initiative has built trade corridors from Asia to Africa to Europe. Russia has linked its energy exports to new currencies. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have begun testing settlements in local money instead of dollars. And with each transaction, a small piece of dollar dependency fades. It's not dramatic, it's incremental, almost invisible. A Saudi oil deal priced in yuan, a new central bank agreement that allows gold-backed settlements, an African nation issuing bonds in local currencies to regional investors. Every time this happens, the psychological monopoly of the dollar weakens a little more, the same way the pound's authority eroded after World War II. One trade partner, one contract, one currency swap at a time. China's strategy is particularly telling. It doesn't announce revolution, it engineers alternatives. The digital yuan, launched in pilot form, is designed for cross-border trade without relying on the SWIFT system. Each trial, each partnership, adds resilience to a system outside Washington's control. Combine that with Beijing's record gold accumulation, and you begin to see the architecture of a world preparing for life after the dollar, not through confrontation, but through parallel construction. Russia, too, has adapted. Sanctioned, isolated, and cut off from Western finance, it turned necessity into innovation. Moscow expanded trade in rubles with energy buyers who didn't want to be entangled in dollar transactions. What began as a survival tactic has become a precedent. The same goes for Iran, India, and even parts of Southeast Asia, where regional payment systems now link local currencies directly. These are small steps, but history shows that systemic change is always a collection of small steps. The pound didn't collapse when the dollar appeared. It declined as more people quietly chose to use something else. Meanwhile, gold, the ancient measure of trust, is back. Central banks across Asia and the Middle East are buying more than at any time since the 1960s. They're not trying to overthrow the dollar. They're hedging against a future where it may no longer guarantee safety. This isn't panic, it's preparation. And when Britain faced this moment, it dismissed it as temporary adjustments. America is repeating the same mistake, mistaking silence for loyalty. Even US allies are diversifying. France has settled energy payments in yuan. India has reduced its US Treasury holdings. Saudi Arabia, once the pillar of the petrodollar, is negotiating oil deals in multiple currencies. The pillars that held up the dollar's empire are no longer unshakable. They're flexible, and flexibility means options. And beneath these moves lies something deeper: fatigue. The world is tired of financial dependency that doubles as political exposure. When every dollar transaction passes through systems that can be frozen or traced, independence feels fragile. That's why alternatives are forming, not to destroy, but to decentralize. It is the same psychological shift that ended the British era. Nations no longer trust one power to be forever fair. If the 20th century was the century of one reserve currency, the 21st may be the century of many. A mosaic of regional systems, some digital, some commodity-based, some bilateral, each reducing the dollar's gravitational pull. The global economy isn't fragmenting, it's realigning. And yet, the irony is sharp. The very model that America once used to build its financial dominance, offering credit, security, and belief to nations weary of Britain's control, is now being mirrored by those weary of America's. The pattern is exact, down to the rhetoric. Back then, Washington promised economic cooperation. Today, Beijing calls it win-win partnership. Different language, same strategy. But what makes this moment unique isn't just geopolitics, it's technology. The British pound fell in the age of ships and telegrams. The dollar rose in the age of telephones and oil. Now we're entering the age of instant digital exchange. Blockchains, central bank digital currencies, and programmable money are dissolving the barriers that once made global currency transitions slow. Change that took decades in the past could unfold in years. The US still has the strongest military, the deepest capital markets, and a culture of innovation. But history doesn't care about strength, it cares about confidence. And confidence is shifting, subtly but steadily, to a world building multiple centers of gravity. We're not witnessing collapse, we're witnessing succession. And succession always feels peaceful until it isn't, because once belief crosses a certain threshold, it doesn't turn back. The pound learned that lesson in 1947. The dollar may learn it next. Decline never feels like decline when you're inside it. It feels like normal life with slightly heavier air. People go to work, markets open, politicians speak of recovery. But beneath the surface, something subtle changes. The mood. Confidence used to be ambient, effortless, invisible. Now it has to be manufactured. That's what Britain lived through after World War II, and what America RS citizens are beginning to sense now, the quiet anxiety of a system that still functions, but no longer inspires faith. In post-war Britain, ordinary people didn't wake up one morning and say, "Our empire is over." They just noticed rationing lasted longer than expected. Prices rose, imports cost more. Jobs that once defined the nation, shipbuilding, coal, textiles, started disappearing. The empire still existed on maps, but not in paychecks. That's how financial decline enters daily life. Not with collapse, but with small adjustments that never reverse. Each adjustment rewires expectations, and soon survival becomes the new definition of success. America, in a quieter way, is touching that same mood. Wages stagnate while asset prices rise. Debt becomes a lifestyle, not a warning. People work more hours to stand still, yet the national narrative insists the system is thriving. The government spends beyond imagination, the currency stretches beyond logic, and faith becomes the final pillar holding it all together. But faith is emotional capital. It burns faster than it's rebuilt. When the pound began to weaken in the 1950s, British pride became defensive. "We still matter," they said. "The world still respects us." And it was true for a while. Old alliances endured. The monarchy endured. The culture endured. But money is the most honest historian. It always tells the truth first. As sterling's global role shrank, so did the country's ability to project power. Britain adjusted, rationalized, and eventually accepted its smaller place in the world. It found stability again, but never the same confidence. The U.S. stands at the emotional edge of that same adjustment. It still leads in innovation, still sets the cultural tempo, still controls the world's financial plumbing. But ordinary Americans feel the tension between image and reality. Record stock markets beside record homelessness, global dominance beside domestic fragility. The story no longer aligns with the experience, and when narratives split from lived truth, people look for new anchors of belief. That's where the shift truly begins. For individuals, the signs are quiet but personal. The sense that savings don't hold value like they used to, that property prices rise faster than effort, that money somehow buys less security than before. The metrics say growth, but the emotion says precarious. It's the same dissonance Londoners felt in the 1950s. Headlines promising progress while the empire was fabric thinned in silence. The tragedy of decline isn't poverty, it's confusion. People keep participating in a story that no longer believes in itself. They still salute the currency, defend its supremacy, quote statistics of strength, because admitting the pattern would feel like betrayal. Britain's citizens believed the pound would rebound. America's believed the dollar will remain eternal. Both beliefs come from the same place, identity. Losing a reserve currency feels like losing part of the national soul, and yet decline also humanizes. It forces humility. It reminds societies that power is rented, not owned. When the British pound finally accepted its new status, the country learned to reinvent, to focus on culture, science, and diplomacy instead of empire. America, if it recognizes its moment early, could do the same. Trade domination for balance, dominance for influence, control for cooperation. But those shifts require awareness, and awareness rarely arrives before denial runs its course. De-Dollarization is not just a financial movement, it's a cultural reckoning. It asks uncomfortable questions. What happens when safe no longer feels safe? When trust migrates elsewhere? When the next generation grows up in a world with no single center of gravity? These questions don't create panic. They create possibility. Empires don't really fall. They dissolve into the systems they once built. The British world became the Commonwealth. The American world may become a network of interdependent powers, each carrying a piece of its legacy. The dollar's decline, if it comes, won't erase America's influence. It will redistribute it. But before redistribution comes realization. And realization starts with ordinary people who sense that something fundamental has shifted, not in charts, but in the air. That's where we stand now, halfway between recognition and reaction, between the comfort of what was and the uncertainty of what's next. Because every currency is a mirror, and the reflection is never about paper or policy. It is about who we think we are, not in defeat, but in uncertainty. And now the dollar stands before that same unfinished sentence. What happens when the symbol of stability begins to tremble? What does a world built on one nation's promise do when that promise starts to sound like a memory? No one can say for sure, but the patterns are clear enough for anyone who's willing to look. Every generation believes it lives outside history's rules. The British believed the empire was eternal. Americans believed the dollar was destiny. Both were wrong in the same way. They mistook global trust for divine right. They forgot that money is never just money. It's belief, organized and shared. And belief has no permanent owner. It belongs to whoever earns it next. What's coming isn't collapse. It's correction. The quiet kind that doesn't make headlines, just adjustments, contracts denominated differently, reserves diversified quietly, alliances redrawn one trade at a time. There's no announcement, no revolution. Just the world rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. The process will feel slow at first, then suddenly fast. Britain thought it had decades before the pound lost its crown. It happened in years. America may think it has generations. It might not. The most powerful nations rarely fall to enemies. They fall to assumptions. The assumption that others will always need their money. That faith, once earned, can't be withdrawn. But faith is a credit line, not a guarantee. It must be serviced with integrity, restraint, and respect. Every sanction, every unilateral decision, every excess of arrogance depletes that balance a little more. And somewhere, quietly, alternatives take root. You can already see them. Central banks increasing gold reserves, nations signing bilateral currency deals, digital payment systems bypassing SWIFT, energy contracts written in currencies once dismissed as irrelevant. These aren't rebellions. They're rehearsals for a world where power is shared instead of dictated, and where history finally fulfills its promise of balance. And maybe that's what this moment is about. Not punishment, but passing. Not decline, but redistribution. The British world didn't vanish when the pound fell. It simply merged into a larger, more plural one. The same might happen with America. Its innovations, its culture, its technology will remain woven into whatever comes next. But its monopoly on monetary trust may not. For most people, that shift will feel abstract until it touches daily life, the cost of imports, the price of fuel, the meaning of savings. Then it becomes personal. Then the story of empires becomes the story of individuals learning to navigate uncertainty. Britain lived that transition quietly, turning from ruler to participant. The United States may have to learn the same humility, to become part of a system it no longer controls. If you step back, it's almost poetic. The nation that once freed the world from Britain's financial chains now feels its own. The same cycle, replayed with new faces. The same belief, tested again. And maybe that's how progress works, not through permanent winners, but through a relay of responsibility. So when you hear the phrase de-dollarization, don't think of collapse. Think of succession. Think of belief finding its next steward. Because no currency, no empire, no story lasts forever. Only the pattern does. The question, the one still unwritten, is who will hold the next belief the world is willing to share. Maybe it's already happening. Maybe it's still decades away. But when it comes, it won't arrive with noise. It'll arrive like all endings do, quietly, inevitably, with the sound of one world exhaling and another breathing in. And as you look around at this moment, at gold rising alliances shifting and digital systems forming in silence, you have to wonder, are we witnessing the end of the dollar's reign, or the birth of what comes after it? That answer, as always, won't come from governments or markets. It'll come from belief. Yours, mine, and the world's collective choice of what to trust next. Because in the end, that's all money ever was. A mirror reflecting what we believe still holds value. And the reflection, once again, is starting to change.